Hello, everybody. About twice a year around these parts, we like to release a bonus episode from the Patreon feed, encourage listeners to support over there, and shamelessly self-promote some of the bonus content that I've been working on. If you are interested in supporting what I'm doing here, you can go over to patreon.com/reflectinghistory. We have a lot of different perks and extra content, bonus stuff that you can get access to, monthly recommendations for stuff that I think is cool and that I'm into in pop culture, dozens of bonus episodes from the world of history, psychology, and philosophy. Now, a couple of different audio courses and podcast series are also available on Patreon. Those with a short memory will remember just last week we released an episode from the series I did on Susanna Clarke's amazing book, Piranesi. The rest of that series is available on Patreon if you want to support. And again, even if you don't, you really got to read that book. One of my favorites. We also have other series and audio courses available. Notably, my series on Nazi Germany and the development of fascism prior to World War II. I call it Nazi Germany and the Battle for the Human Heart. This is now on Patreon. I have a 9-episode podcast series on the television show Arcane, which was a lot of fun. There's stuff on the Dark Knight trilogy and some incoming podcast series that I'm working on as well. So you can support for as long or as little as you like and get access to all that stuff, which might be cool. And again, all of that stuff is on patreon.com/reflectinghistory, and there's a link to all of that in the show notes. You can also support the podcast in other ways. Sometimes the simplest and easiest way to support is just continue listening to the podcast, which I'm very grateful for. You can tell a friend or family member about the podcast. You can leave a rating or review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Even if you don't listen on these platforms, a good rating allows the podcast to acquire some clout, which I'm told is good. And I'm also developing a bit of a long-term project, which is a email newsletter. So you can sign up for that on my website or in the show notes to the podcast. And the basic idea is for this to be a free, low-stress, monthly to quarterly-ish email that offers historical perspective on modern-day issues, behind-the-scenes content on my latest podcast stuff, historical lessons and takeaways from the world of history, psychology, and philosophy. The point is for it to be only a couple times a year, always constructive, useful, and positive. So again, that's a bit of a long-term project that is hopefully going to launch sometime next year, but you can sign up for it now. Okay, with all that being said, what you're about to hear is a bonus episode from the Patreon feed. Hopefully you enjoy it, and as always, thanks for listening. After the singularity, most people chose to die. It's a great opening line to a story, and it sets the tone for what you're about to read in Ken Liu's short story, Staying Behind. Everyone listening to this is probably somewhat familiar with the science fiction trope of humans uploading their consciousness into some sort of computer or some sort of machine and potentially living forever. We're all familiar with The Matrix, we're all familiar with Black Mirror episodes, and this idea is not necessarily uncommon in the world of fiction. But what Ken Liu does in this short story is he focuses on the people who choose to stay behind. In other stories or movies or TV shows about this topic, it's often granted as a given that everybody would want to upload themselves into the singularity. But what seems much more human and probably much more realistic is that there would be backlash to this. Factions would develop, and a good chunk of people probably wouldn't want to live as consciousness in a machine. So Ken Liu focuses his story on this sort of conflict between the people who choose to stay behind and the people who choose to live forever, so to speak. Early on in the story, the narrator describes how the process works. Quote, "For every uploaded man, there was a lifeless body left behind. The brain a bloody, pulpy mess after the destructive scanning procedure. But what really happened to him? His essence, his, for lack of a better word, soul. Was he now an artificial intelligence, or was he still somehow human, with silicone and graphene performing the functions of neurons? Was it merely a hardware upgrade for consciousness? Or has he become a mere algorithm, a clockwork imitation of free will?" End quote. In the story, most people are choosing to die. They're choosing to leave behind their bodies in that bloody, pulpy mess that Lou describes, and they're choosing to upload themselves into another realm and live forever. And all of this might seem like science fiction nonsense to some of us, but like a lot of fiction and like a lot of science fiction, taking it seriously forces us to ask questions and to think about what it really means to be human. As the narrator describes in that quote I just read, what exactly would it mean to upload yourself into the singularity? Is it living forever? Is it the afterlife? Is it a AI simulation? Is it just the continuation of being human? Or is it something different? Who is more human, the people who choose to stay behind or the people who choose to upload themselves into the singularity? What does it mean to be human? That's a tough question to ask and a tough question to answer, but it seems to me at least that as long as there's been humans, history seems to indicate that the afterlife is something that human beings think about quite a bit. You can go all the way back to Paleolithic cave paintings or ancient Egypt and the mummies or the heyday of the Roman Catholic Church. And there seems to be this consistent theme in humanity of thinking about an afterlife. It's kind of a little bit ironic that it seems like there's something inherent in human nature that isn't really human. It's beyond human. Part of being human might be not being human anymore, advancing beyond that. For some of us, at least. Some of us might also believe that death gives life meaning. The fact that it's all going to end at some point makes every day, every moment that much more meaningful. But what if there was no death? How would you find ways to give your life meaning? What if living forever in the afterlife was something permanent and something that had become human? Would life still have meaning if there was no death? I like this story because I think the main characters in the story struggle with this idea. They have different beliefs on what a good death is, what death means, what it means to be human, and whether or not you need death to have a good life. And the conflict and the struggle between the narrator and his family turns this philosophical set of questions into real life character moments that make the story more interesting and more human, believe it or not. Another theme of the story, besides the idea of an afterlife, is the idea of human progress. I've talked about this theme in some of my history podcasts where you have this idea of civilization and civilization being a staircase. Many people believe that humanity has been slowly ascending this staircase of civilization. There's this idea of progress from the old cavemen all the way through Neolithic man, all the way into the modern globe-trotting species that we are today. Any movement up the staircase is seen as positive and good, and any movement down the staircase is seen as negative and immoral and bad. But as I've pointed out in other episodes of this podcast, it might be worth it to question that idea of civilization as progress. In the story, the people who choose to stay behind are living in a bit of a dystopian society. The narrator feels like they're regressing into the past. The technology is no longer improving. Computers don't work like they did before. Culture is stagnant. There's no new music. There's no new sources of entertainment or technology. And perhaps because of this regression, more and more people are choosing to upload themselves into the Matrix. But there's also an alternative point of view. In the story, as the narrator is thinking back to the past and a visit through Native American lands that he and his family went on, and he thinks about a piece of Native American pottery that his mother bought from a tourist shop. The narrator talks about his feelings while he was holding the pot, and his mom and dad were having a conversation about progress versus tradition. Quote, "Amazing, isn't it?" Mom said. "This wasn't made on a potter's wheel. The woman coiled it by hand, using the same techniques that have been passed down for generations in her family. She even dug for the clay in the same places that her great-grandmother used. She's keeping alive an ancient tradition, a way of life." The pot suddenly felt heavy in my hands, as though I could sense the weight of its generations of memory. "That's just a story to drum up business," Dad said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "But it would be even sadder if the story were true. If you're doing things the exact same way as your ancestors, then your way of life is dead, and you've become a fossil, a performance for the entertainment of tourists." "She was not performing," Mom said. "You have no sense of what's really important in life, what's worth holding on to. There's more to being human than progress." End quote. So again, we see the different themes of this story are all playing on this idea of what does it mean to be human? Is it the afterlife? Belief in an afterlife or desire to go into an afterlife? Maybe. Is it this idea of human progress? What's more valuable? Blazing a new pathway into the future or holding on to the traditions of the past? The idea of progress plays a pivotal role in the story, and conversations like the quote that we just read point out the problems of defining humanity as progress. As we've seen, what happens when there's regression instead of progress? Or how do you even define progress? Who gets to define how progress gets made? In this example, would progress be uploading into the simulation? Or would progress for humanity be staying behind? What makes us more human? The future or the past? Looking forward to the promise of technology in the future, or admiring the intricacies of ancient pottery? Another idea about what makes us human is potentially just the ability to make that choice. As we learn, the narrator's mom is against uploading into the singularity, but the choice gets made for her by the narrator's father, so the mom never gets to make that choice. And when it comes time for the narrator's daughter to make that choice, the narrator, hypocritically perhaps, doesn't want her to be able to make that choice, at least not at first. So perhaps the ability to make choices is something that makes us human. And this idea of choice is another thing that Ken Liu plays around with in the story. If the story is asking difficult questions of us about what makes us human, then perhaps another answer that the story gives as a potential solution is the idea of struggle. Perhaps there's something inherently human about overcoming difficulties and struggling to make the best of life, overcoming obstacles, solving problems. From this viewpoint, it's not supposed to be easy. Oftentimes, when you think back on life and what you've done in the past, it's those moments that are difficult and were ultimately a struggle. Fighting through those moments and overcoming them, those are the moments in life that are memorable. That's how you grow as a person. There's a whole branch of philosophy, more or less, known as Stoicism, that is, again, more or less about embracing that struggle, embracing the difficulties of life and moving through anyway, overcoming things individually and transcending your circumstances to make the best out of life. Maybe that's what gives life meaning. But in this realm of philosophy, usually it's only applied to the individual, at the individual level, the self. What about the idea of struggle collectively as a human species? Is there any truth to the idea of collective struggle over the centuries, over hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years? Has all of that struggle collectively over the years become something that is innately human? And what would happen if that struggle got taken away? What if there was no more struggle? You could simply upload yourself into the Matrix and all of your problems would disappear. You would live in paradise forever. Would you still be human? By this view, it is not the afterlife or not a simulation or not the singularity that gives life meaning. Rather, it's the struggle, the battle against inevitable mortality. So by this view, it is the people who stay behind who represent humanity more than the people who go into the Matrix. The narrator talks about how his mother believed in this idea of struggle and this theme of authenticity as something that might make us human. Quote, "She taught me that our mortality makes us human. The limited time given to each of us makes what we do meaningful. We die to make place for our children, and through our children, a piece of us lives on, the only form of immortality that is real. It is this world, the world we were meant to live in, that anchors us and demands our presence, not the imagined landscapes of a computed illusion." End quote. I think it's worth mentioning and talking a bit about the ending of the story as well. The question you're probably asking, or at least the question I was asking at the end of the story, was, did the father shoot the daughter? Was he willing to kill her in order to prevent her from going into the Matrix and losing her humanity, at least the way that he saw it? So does he shoot her or does he let her go? I think one of the cool things about the story is that it's left open for interpretation. And depending on how you feel about these ideas of struggle and authenticity and the afterlife and choice and progress, different people might come to different conclusions about how the story ends. For what it's worth, after reading the story a couple of times, I'm not sure that coming to a definitive conclusion on what the father chose to do in that scenario is necessarily the point of the story. Perhaps this idea of letting go is inherently human as well. Obviously, the narrator has issues letting go. He was never really satisfied with the way his mother entered the singularity, and he certainly, during the story, didn't want his daughter to go into the singularity. To him, at least in the beginning of the story, he believes that it's the people who go into the singularity who can't let go because they can't deal with death, so they have to live in an illusion. Their inability to let go of the fleeting human experience drives them into a fake life, at least according to him. To him, tradition is more valuable than progress. But in this case, maybe too, it's the dad who can't let go and accept the reality of human progress. Maybe he's still trying to hold on to something that humanity has advanced beyond. So I think it's kind of cool how whatever side you land on in this scenario, it's still human in a way. Whether it's clinging on to tradition embracing struggle and mortality, the people in the story find ways to make that human. But there's also this other idea of human as progress and the future and moving on. Both the people in the singularity and the people who stay behind find ways to not give up. And they both find ways to be human throughout the story. And maybe that's what the story is trying to say.